Welcome to this week's edition of Outdoors Online, a weekly webcast produced by the North Dakota Game and Fish Department. I'm your host, Mike Anderson. My guest this week is waterfowl biologist Mike Szymanski. Today we're going to talk about the Spring Light Goose Conservation Order. Mike, what exactly is that?
So we have a conservation order in spring. It's outside of your typical migratory bird treaty dates, so that's why it's a conservation order and not a season. But we have that in the spring to help provide extra hunting opportunity, not only for hunters, but also to provide extra harvest pressure on mid-continent light geese.
Okay, and we've had this conservation order since early 2000s?
Yes, 1999 was our first conservation order in North Dakota, and we've been able to have it every year since.
Why are we concerned about the numbers of light geese?
There's some concern mostly with their Arctic breeding habitats. They have a very aggressive way of foraging where they dig up the rhizomes of the plants that they're feeding on besides what's on the surface. So in that tundra environment, it takes a very long time for habitats to recover. And in some places where you have, especially where you have snow geese and Ross's geese both breeding but also staging in those areas, it's a pretty rough environment for the tundra plants. So they're pretty tough on it, and we've got other concerns with other areas of the Arctic where we were seeing some pretty bad impacts of overgrazing, grubbing into those soils, but by and large it's a numbers issue. The population of mid-continent light geese has grown exponentially for several decades. Leading up to this concern, documentation of the destroyed habitats, and then you get other situations further south where they're staging in the fall, spring, and winter, where there gets to be a little bit of a disease concern where they're commingling with other migratory bird species, and there's just millions of birds in one spot, and sort of having this possibility of becoming a vector for some other wildlife disease.
For the last 20 plus years, Mike, is the conservation order working?
Yeah, and that's become a topic of discussion amongst waterfowl managers and some hunting constituencies where we keep seeing these very large estimates of a population size for mid-continent light geese. And I think initially we had some fairly unrealistic expectations about what we were going to do with harvest to impact population growth, population size. Since then, we've also learned that there's probably way more mid-continent light geese than we thought initially, so the impact of hunting can't be as strong. But on the flip side, with the conservation order, we harvest a little more than half of our total annual harvest of mid-continent light geese with the conservation order. So that's roughly 500,000 birds harvested that we wouldn't get otherwise. So we've had this kind of dampening effect on the population growth rate that we wouldn't have had without the conservation order. It just wouldn't be replaced by fall harvest if we didn't do it.
Okay. When does the conservation order start in North Dakota this year?
In North Dakota, we're starting it this year, February 22nd, and we're ending May 10th. We start in February. It's always kind of a little bit of a joke for us because of how our winters usually look, but we do it on the early side because there's no real limitation as to whether we can start or not, and we may as well have it open just in case things break early. We've had a couple years where people have been able to shoot geese in February. It's not very widespread. Probably not going to happen this year unless things dramatically turn around, but we do open February 22nd.
Let's explain that, Mike. So the spring migration depends on the snow line.
Right, yeah, it's the snow and ice line where the birds are proceeding north. They're not going to do a northward move in January because of day length, but you start getting into later February, and they're pushing as far north as they can, and we're dependent on what kind of open water we have and snow cover, for birds to get into the fields and forage. So if we're all iced up and the snow hasn't melted to create sheet water for them to roost on, they're just not going to be here yet.
Okay, and what licenses do hunters need? for the spring lake goose conservation order?
So resident hunters need to have a valid small game and general game habitat stamp or sportsman's license. Those need to be renewed April 1st every year. So you can hunt with your old one up until through March 31st, and then April 1st you need to have a new one. Non-residents need the $50 non-resident spring snow goose license that's good for the whole season. All hunters need a renewed North Dakota HIP registration for 2020, and there's no duck stamp requirement, so nobody needs to have a new duck stamp or anything like that to use during the conservation order.
Okay, and hunting in the spring is a little different than hunting in the fall as well. Let's go over some of those regulations.
I mean there's differences both in regulations and also kind of how you go about doing your business as a hunter. Regulations are relaxed a little bit through the conservation order. Again, this isn't a hunting season, so this is why we can do some of these different things. Hunters can use electronic calls. That's very important for snow goose hunting. Unplugged shotguns, and hunting until 30 minutes after sunset, which is a little bit abnormal from our fall regulations. The 30 minutes after sunset isn't used typically as much, but the other two provisions are quite popular and useful. Yeah, so besides the extra provisions that are available regulatory-wise, there's also a little difference in equipment that people typically use in the spring, whereas guys are probably more commonly using four-wheelers or other UTVs to get out into fields just because of muddy conditions. Maybe larger snow goose spreads, a little more consistency and the ability to hunt a migration versus scouting and finding specific feed fields, things like that.
Mike, do they use the same flight path in the fall as they do in the spring?
In the spring, it's shifted a little bit further east and a little more bottlenecked, I would say. There's a very strong corridor that goes up Highway 281 through North and South Dakota that's basically following the James River lowlands. By the time they hit the interstate, they start to kind of branch out across the state, heading more both north and northwest through the state. And then there's other, small migration corridors that are, they're not as long a duration. The geese might only go through there for a couple of days. You might see a couple 100,000 geese come up through the Missouri Coteau for a couple of days, things like that. But the 281 corridor is really the strong migration route coming up north in the spring.
Going into winter, we had a wet fall. A lot of places got a lot of snow. How does that affect people hunting this spring?
Yeah, absolutely. We had probably most everybody knows, a very abnormal fall for moisture, and we've also got a lot of snow in the eastern part of the state going into that 281 corridor. So it's going to be very, very wet. Probably very hard to get around. Geese are going to have a lot of opportunities to be in, I would say, almost anywhere with the sheet water that's going to be on the landscape as a result. So folks are going to have to be very careful in the decisions that they make for going down different roads. There's going to be a lot fewer places people will be able to go with their trucks and decoy trailers, things like that. The ATV, UTV component is going to be really important for getting off trail whatsoever, and folks are going to be, as always, need to be very cognizant of what they're doing as far as impacting people's fields or anything like that, making ruts or mudding things up. That's always discouraged.
A lot of great information, Mike. Thank you.
You bet.
For more information about the Spring Light Goose Conservation Order, visit the Game and Fish Department's website at gf.nd.gov. For waterfowl biologist Mike Szymanski and the rest of the staff here at the Game and Fish Department, thanks for joining us for this week's Outdoors Online. We'll see you again next week.